Mekuta Sicha is Chelek Yud Aleph, the Sicha of Boy Aleph, a Nigla Sicha. And we're going to discuss today, we're going to explore the concept of Melaches Oichel Nefesh. Melacha that is forbidden on Shabbos, but because it is related to food preparation, it is mutter on Yomtov. Based on what is it mutter on Yomtov? And what is the concept that leads to this heter? And based on that, we'll understand the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch and the way he phrases this, that in the beginning may seem to be somewhat contradictory, but in the end, in the conclusion, will turn out to be very, very well understood and very well chosen words. So let us begin. Kasuv Parsha Seinu, it says in our Parsha, the Kesher l'Chag HaPesach, with regards to Chag HaPesach, Uvayim Arishim Mikakedesh Goimar Kol Malacha Le'yasa Bahem Ach Asher Yochel L'Chol Nefesh Hu Levade Yeyasa Lachem. On the first day, it shall be designated holy, should not do any malacha, any work, but that which is eaten or used for food, that alone can be done by you or for you. Hainu. So Yomtov Asr Basiyas Malacha Keshabbos, the Yomtov generally, malacha, work, is Asr on Shabbos, Asr on Yomtov like Shabbos. Prat li malacha shein l'tzedek echel nefesh shein mutar is b'Yomtov. However, there is an exception on Yomtov and the holidays, on the festivals, and that is that malachas that are related to food preparation are mutter. Now, this is the first time it's mentioned is in Parshas Boy, in this week's Parsha. V'nishna isur dasiyas malacha kama pa'am b'teira b'chol chag b'fnei atzmei. This isur, this prohibition of malacha, is then repeated numerous times throughout the Torah when discussing each specific yomtiv. U'bekulam nemar kol meleches avoida loisasu. Always when it speaks about the prohibition of malacha and yomtiv, it uses the term meleches avoida, which would mean a work, strenuous work that comes with labor. The loipirish be'emakosuf heter asiyas meleches eichel nefesh, and then however, in those other psukim, the Torah does not explicitly permit eichel nefesh. It doesn't clarify this permissibility of meleches eichel nefesh. So in Parshas Boy, it says it very clearly that malacha doesn't say meleches avoida. It just says malacha. The malacha is not allowed, but eichel nefesh is allowed on Yom Tov. And in the other Yom Tovim, the other time it's mentioned, it clarifies meleches avoida is aser. Malacha of labor or strenuous work is aser, and does not address meleches eichel nefesh to tell us that it is mutter. The Tzarech Love and Tam Shnei Melos, we have to understand the reasoning for these differences. Why in Parshas Boy it says melacha regular, and then it explains that eichel nefesh is mutter, and why in the rest of the times that it gets mentioned it says meleches avoida is aser, and does not mention specifically the heter or the permission or the permissibility of meleches eichel nefesh, food related melachas. Hine the Ramban discusses this, and he says like this: Pirish meleches avoida kol melacha she'ein l'tzedek echel nefesh. That the word meleches avoida, what does it mean? Laborious work or strenuous work. This is a reference to melacha that's not food related. Kinyan shenemar, food preparation related. I'm just going to use the word food related because it's shorter and easier. But talking about a melacha that is used to prepare food. Like it says in the pasuk, you should work 6 days a week. Or another pasuk it says work in the field is called avoida. Or another pasuk it says v'ne'avadotem v'nizratem. When it comes to, it uses the word avoida with regards to planting. U'melacha shehi be'oichel nefesh hi meleches hanoah le meleches avoida. So meleches avoida, says the Ramban, refers to melacha that's not related to food preparation. And if it is related to food preparation, it's not called meleches avoida. It's called meleches hanoah. It's called melacha that is enjoyable or that is beneficial. And this says that Ramban is explained in the Torah. When the Torah says kol malacha plain, don't do any malacha, then he has to explain that oichel nefesh, that food preparation work, is permissible. So the other Yomim Tovim, he says it more concisely, that any melechas avodah is not allowed. Lesser kol malacha she'eina nena oichel nefesh, to prohibit malacha that is not food preparation related. And that way, it automatically tells us that oichel nefesh is mutter. By saying the words melakas avodah excludes melechas oichel nefesh, food-related work, and therefore we understand that only melechas avodah is aser, but melechas oichel nefesh is mutter. The lo yemer hakasav lo'elam be'echad mikol shar yomim tovim kol melacha. In none of the other places does it say the word melacha plain, and none of the other places does it say that oichel nefesh is mutter, because by the words melachas avodah automatically explain to us which melachas are aser. And because in our parsha, in Parshas Boy, it says the word kol melacha and doesn't say melachas avodah. Therefore, only here do you need the explanation and the clarification that oichel nefesh would be mutter, because it didn't say melachas avodah is aser. He said melacha is aser. So he has to say, one second, when I say melacha, I do not include oichel nefesh, which he wouldn't have understood because I didn't explain that I was talking about melachas avodah. So then, therefore, we understand from the words of the Ramban, the only prohibition on Yomtov is Meleches Aveda. This alone teaches us the Meleches Eichel Nefesh, food preparation related work, was never prohibited in the first place. Because food related work is not considered Meleches Aveda. Okay, so this Ramban answers our question about Tam Shinuyim Eila, why it's different in Parshas Boy than the other Parshas. It begins to explain it. In other words, that according to the Ramban, Meleches Oichel Nefesh it was never Aser in the first place, and therefore whenever it does speak the Iser of Melacha and Yomtov, it says Meleches Avodah. The exception to that is in Parshas Boy, where since it says Kol Melacha Lo Ye'asa B'hem without saying Melechas Avodah, therefore it has to clarify that Melechas Eichel Nefesh is mutter on Yomtov. Doesn't explain why in Parshas Boy it says it this way, but it does explain why it's different than other places, because since it says Kol Melacha, therefore it has to clarify that Eichel Nefesh is mutter. Everywhere else it says Melechas Avodah, because Melechas Avodah specifically excludes Eichel Nefesh, food-related work, and on Yomtov, Torah only prohibited of Melechas Avodah, not Melechas Eichel Nefesh. Pretty clear so far. In Ois Beis, he's going to introduce a chakira, a debate. He's going to explore the reasoning, the background of this permissibility of doing Melechas Eichel Nefesh, doing work that is food related on Yomtov. V'hinei this permissibility to do melechas eichel nefesh and yomtiv can be explained in two different ways. Aleph, the first way, even if it's food-related work, they are inherently problematic, prohibited. Because they would be included in what it says in this week's parsha, that any malacha should not be done, which would include even eichel nefesh. But if you're doing this work for the sake of food preparation, the Torah excludes it from the rule, from the general concept of kol malacha, any malacha. Hainu, Meaning to say, that in fact that it's food related is a reason and a cause to say it's mutter. In other words, any melacha, even oichel nefesh, is aser. And Torah says on Yomtov there is an exclusion to this rule, and that is that if it's food related, there is a specific reason. This is an important word, tam. There's a specific reason to say it's mutter in this case. So that's the first way. Every melacha is aser, but on oichel nefesh, even though it's inherently a melacha, but nevertheless, because you're using it for food, and on Yomtov there's a mitzvah to have food, and so on and so forth, so there's a special exclusion to the rule. Base. There's another way of looking at it, and this is how it would seem that it is the shita, is the approach of the Ramban. To begin with, oichel nefesh, food-related work, is not even part of considered work. And the fact that this pasuk comes in our parsha to exclude food-related work, is not creating an exception, but it's actually explaining the kol malacha. The first part of the pasuk said no malacha should be done. Comes the second half of the pasuk to explain. What does that mean? That this prohibition of melacha and Yomtov does not apply, never applied to melachas that are food related, and it's only applicable to melachas that are not food related. Hainu she'asher yachal lechol nefesh, the fact that it's being used for food, whose siman. Before we use the word tam, a reason, meaning to say is that was aser, but we have a special reason to make it mutter. The second approach is that it's a siman, it's an indicator. Ukvius ha'agdara, and defines the parameters of which malachas the Isser does not apply to begin with. In other words, there's certain things the malacha, the Isser never begins. Which one is that? Oichel nefesh. So approach number one is that it's inherently aser, but there's a special reason to say that you could still cook or do food-related preparation, food-related melachas on Yomtov. The second approach, which is seemingly the Ramban's approach, is that lechatchila was never aser. The whole prohibition of melacha only applies to melachas that are not food-related. And in other words, the first approach says ta'am, that food is a reason lahatir, something that's inherently aser. And the second approach is called simin. It's an indicator of which melachas were never included in the prohibition to begin with, melachas of oichel nefesh. V'nafkamina lahalacha. What is the practical relevance between these two approaches? Hamis'ana beYomtov. Somebody who fasts on Yomtov, imutir midiraisa b'melachas oichel nefesh, if midiraisa is allowed to cook or do other food-related work on Yomtov. According to the approach, which was the first approach, that these melachas are inherently aser, but because they are food, they were given a special exemption. How do you move on? So it only applies to someone who's actually eating. Someone who needs the food can now go and cook on Yomtov because he has a reason that he needs to do the melacha. But somebody who fasts on Yomtov, since he has no need in these melachas because he's not eating, the Isser remains. In other words, since you need a reason to undo the Isser, then only if you're actually going to eat the food can you undo the Isser. But according to the approach, the second approach, that these melachas, food-related melachas, never became aser in the first place, then even if someone is fasting, it doesn't matter. Because it's not about my need. It's about the fact that because it's food-related, it never became aser in the first place. So, We have two approaches. One approach is that they're usher, but when it comes to, because I'm using it for food, it becomes permissible. There's sort of an exception to the rule. And the other approach is that lechatchila it never became usher. The only prohibition of melacha and Yomtov is non-food preparation related work. Now we're going to introduce a machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and a concept called mitoich shehutra letzorech, hutra nami shalei letzorech. For example, we know today that people that will push a stroller on Yomtov, and obviously on Shabbos not, if there's no eruv. Now, pushing a stroller has no food. You're not eating. It's not related to food, but carrying is related to food because you have to borrow some sugar. You have to bring a challah. You have to bring the food from place to place. You have to carry in the Shus Rabbim or outside of a Shus Yachid. So once carrying became mutter, it became mutter even if it's not being used specifically for food. And this is actually a machlekes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel in the Gourarie in Beya. So the we could say that this machlekes of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is this same machlekes. Why is ochel nefesh mutter? The Mishnah over there says Beis Shammai oimrim ein metzin le'esakaton v'chulu. The Beis Shammai says you cannot carry a baby or a sefer Torah outside on Yomtov. Beis Hillel matirin. Beis Hillel says you are allowed to. Umefarish b'Gemara. The Gemara explains the pligi I amrinon miteich shehutra letzerech echel nefesh. That the argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is based on if you follow this rule of mitoich. According to Beis Hillel, you say that once this melacha became mutter because you need it for food-related work, it now became mutter for everything. So once you're allowed to carry in the Shus Rabbim, you have to be able to carry food. You're allowed to carry other things too, and therefore Beis Shammai holds you're allowed to carry a baby or a sefer Torah in the Shus Rabbim on Yomtov. Beis Shammai, if I said Beis Shammai before, I meant Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel says matirin, because Beis Hillel holds the miteich shehutra shalei letzerech, miteich shehutra letzerech, hutra nami shalei letzerech. Beis Shammai does not hold this rule. Beis Shammai holds that only things that are tzerech echel nefesh mamish, actually food being used for food, only that is mutter. So if I'm carrying a challah to a farbrengen, it's okay. But to carry a baby or a sefer Torah, since it's not directly related to food, you can't do it. You don't say just because once it was opened up for food related things, it's also opened up for other things. The Shammai doesn't hold that. So that's the machlekes of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and about carrying in the Shus Rabbim on Yomtov. The Beis Shammai says you are not allowed to carry anything that's not food. Beis Hillel says you are allowed to carry things that are not food, and the Gemara explains that the machlekes is dependent on whether they hold of the rule that once you're mated it, once it became mutter for the purpose of food, it's also mutter for other purposes as well. Now, so now let's apply this machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel to this debate, to this discussion that we're having here with regards to the origin of the heter of melacha seichel nefesh. Let's say like this: to Beis Hillel, Savri, the ba'acha sheyachal lechol nefesh hufku melacha seichel nefesh migader iser meikara. That when the pasuk says that melacha seichel nefesh is mutter, this undoes the iser to begin with, like we said in the second way, or like we said according to the Ramban. And therefore they become mutter. Carrying is not also on Yomtov, because since it's a melacha that's used for food, it never was included in the melachas avodah to begin with, and therefore it's mutter. It doesn't matter now at this point what you're doing it, what you're using it for. Once it's a melacha that's used for echel nefesh, it becomes a mutter diki melacha, and therefore it doesn't matter what you're using it for. Beis Shammai Sabri, and Beis Shammai holds that the pasuk that permits melachas echel nefesh is only a reason to permit melachas that are be'etzem aser, prohibited, And because of that, only when that reason specifically applies does it become mutter, which is food. But if it's not using it for food, it retains its original isser, and you can't do it. And therefore, Shammai does not hold of the rule that once you permitted it for the sake of food, it's also permitted for other reasons as well. And therefore, Shammai holds that you cannot carry a baby or a sefer Torah outside. So not only do we now have two approaches in understanding Eichel Nefesh, it seems that these are the two approaches of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel with this practical application of carrying a baby outside. The Beis Shammai will say you're not allowed to because carrying is inherently asur and it's only mutter if you're actually using it for food. And Beis Hillel holds that no, because it's a food-related malacha, it was never asur in the first place. Now let's hold off now on this machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel for a moment, because we're going to get back to it. And we're going to see a machlekes Rashi and Tosfos within the shita of Beis Hillel, which is the halacha. But before we get to that, we're going to introduce the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. What does the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch say on this topic? And we're going to see that initially it's going to seem like a stira, a contradiction within the words of the Alter Rebbe. Ois Gimel. Admor Hazakim b'Shulchanei Kesef. Rishon u'Shvi shel Pesach v'Chag HaShavuos v'chulu, the first and seventh day of Pesach, and obviously in Chutz La'aretz that includes the second and the eighth day, and then the day of Shavuos. Hey Nanikroim Yom Tevim, these are called Yomtov. V'chaleisim Meleches Aveda v'Echas Miyam. Notice the Alter Rebbe uses the word Aveda. Anyone who does Meleches Aveda, strenuous work, on any of these days that is a leikim in Atera receives Malchus. Shenemar, like the pasuk says, Kol Meleches Aveda le'sasu. Umaro Meleches Aveda. So what says the Alter Rebbe goes into the category of Meleches Aveda? Kol Melacha she'eina nasis be'echel mashke. Any food that is not being used for food or drink. So what does he say? Meleches Aveda is asur. What's Meleches Aveda? Anything that's not food or drink. Then the Alter Rebbe continues. Avol kol melacha nasis be'echel mashke. Any melacha, any work that is being used for food or drink, nikroin kol melachas elu meleches eichel nefesh. These melachas are called food-related work. Shehatera hitira la'asoisa. That the Torah permitted you to do them. L'tzedech achilas yontiv, in order for the food that has to be eaten on Yomtov. The pasuk says that which is being used for food, that can be done by you on Yomtov. So now the Rebbe explains that which the first half of the words of the Alter Rebbe, where he says that what's considered Melechas Aveda, which is also on Yomtov. Melacha that is not done with eichel mashke, with food or drink. Mashma kisvaras Ramban de Melechas Aveda piris melacha shein tzeder eichel nefesh. Seems to imply, like the Ramban, that Melechas Aveda means any melacha that's not food related. V'lechei Melechas eichel nefesh muteres meikara, which means that what's asur? Only non-food related work, which means that food related work never became asur in the first place. Which is what we said, like the Ramban, or like the second approach in Ois Beis. But then when the Alter Rebbe continues and says, the Torah had to permit you to do it, implying that it was initially not permitted. Is mashma that these malachas are truly, really part of the malachas that are asur, that are prohibited on Yomtiv? It's just that the Torah in our pasuk, in Parshas Boy, permitted them when it comes to eating food. That the whole reason that these malachas are mutter is only because of the food, not that the food is a siman to tell me that it was never asur. It was asur, and the food is a reason to make it mutter. Asur is because they are inherently asur. So this seems to create a contradiction in the words of the Alter Rebbe. The first half of the Alter Rebbe's words in the Shulchan Aruch imply that only Melechas Aveda was Aser, which means only non-food related Melechas were Aser, which would imply that food related Melacha was never Aser in the first place. But by using the word Hutra, that it became Mutter, implies that it was Aser. And because you're using it for food, is a Tam La'ater. So we have to understand what does the Alter Rebbe hold, and why do his words seem to contradict each other. Okay. Now, we're going to go in Nois Daled. We're going to introduce a Machlekes Rashi and Tosfos in the understanding of Shitas Beis Hillel, and we're going to try to understand what is the background, or what is the reasoning of Rashi and Tosfos, what is their argument based on. Rashi was fairly simple. As we'll see, Rashi pretty much follows the Shita of the Ramban, that Meleches Oichel Nefesh never became Aser in the first place, and therefore these Melachas are Mutter. But the Tosfos is going to say something that's going to raise a question, and we're going to have to understand what is the basis and the reasoning of Tosfos' argument with Rashi. Okay. V'hinei, B'pirush Das Beis Hillel, Miteich shehuter letzerech, huter nami shelei letzerech. And according to explain the opinion of Beis Hillel, that because it became mutter for the purpose of food-related work, it therefore is mutter even with regards to other work. Pligi Rashi, the Rashi and Tosfos disagree. Rashi mefaresh shehutra hamalacha gam im eina letzerech klal hainu shemideraisa muteres hamalacha legamri. Rashi says that this permissibility of melacha she'eina letzerech eichel nefesh, melacha that is not food related but using a food related melacha. For example, carrying which is mutter because it's needed for food. Beis Hillel is now telling us that even if you're not actually using it for food, it's still mutter. You can carry your baby to shul. So Rashi says, even if there's no need, even if you're engaging in something that has no necessity for you whatsoever, mid'eraisa, it's still mutter. In other words, carrying is mutter. Carrying is not a malacha on Yomtov. And therefore, according to Rashi, you're allowed to carry even if it's not food related, and even if there's no necessity for this on Yom Tov. It's something that you can do tomorrow. Nevertheless, it's not a malacha. You can do it. According to if it's midrabanan, there's going to need to be a necessity. But mid'eraisa, the shita of Rashi is that you do not need any necessity once it's hutra shalei letzerech. Once it became mutter, even if it's not for food, and even if there's zero necessity, this is something that can totally be done in 6 years from now. You ought to do it today, mid'eraisa. The Tosfos argues and holds the heter shalei letzerech hainu she'ein batzerech eichel nefesh. The fact that it says that even if it's for no necessity, it's still mutter. That means if there's no necessity for food, it's still mutter. Avol tzarech liyas tzerech hayem ktsas. There has to be some necessity for the day of. Hainu shegam mid'eraisa lehutra malacha legamri ve'eina muteres elim kenyes batzerech hayem ktsas. Tosfos holds that even mid'eraisa, midrabanan they'll agree. Everyone agrees that there has to be some need. But mid'eraisa, Rashi says that there does not have to be any need whatsoever. Tosfos says no. It may not need oichel nefesh. It may not need to be food related. But a malacha that is usually used for food, that is not food related, but there has to be some necessity for the day of Yom Tov in order for us to activate this heter of miteich shehutra letzerech, hutra nami shalei letzerech. So the Moshe, if you want to take your kid to shul, then you need it for today. You want to bring the kid to shul, so it's fine. But if you have something else that you need to do that really you can do tomorrow or the day after Yom Tov, then and there's no need for it to be done on Yom Tov, then according to Tosfos mid'eraisa, you would not be allowed to do this melacha because there has to be some tzorech. There has to be some necessity. It's not just a free-for-all that once we opened it up, you could do whatever you want. So now let's understand Taisus' Shita. Rashi's Shita is understood very clearly. Rashi's Shita is that a malacha like carrying is not asr on Yomtov. It's a malachas eichel nefesh. It's not a malachas hanoah. It's not malachas avodah. It's not included in the yisur of malacha to begin with, and therefore, once it's mutter, even if it's food related, if it's not food related, even if it's something that I don't need to do today, it doesn't matter. Just like I'm allowed to walk, even though I don't need to walk today, I'm allowed to walk because my walking is not a malacha. I'm allowed to carry because carrying is not a malacha. That's the Ramban's Shita. That's Rashi's Shita in the understanding of Beis Hillel. Taisus seemingly has to agree that carrying or other malachas oichel nefesh are mutter, or were not asr in the first place, because otherwise, how could he say that it's hutra shalei l'tzeirich? How could Taisus say that if it's not food related, it's still mutter? So clearly, there has to be a more open heter for malachas eichel nefesh, more than the original first approach that we had in Ois Beis. But he throws in a caveat. He says, Taisus, that you have to have tzerich ktsas. Why? Let's see this inside. According to what we explained before, the Beis Hillel holds that food-related work was not included in the Issa to begin with. Rashi is very well understood. These malachas are mutter, even if there's no need for them, because they were never included in the Issa in the first place. But Taisus has to be understood. Before he asks this question, he's going to clarify what we just explained as follows. We can't say that Taisus argues with Rashi on Siman versus Tam. That Rashi holds Siman. That Rashi holds that these malachas were never mutter, were never asr. And Taisus holds they are be'etzem asr. But it's just that Torah gives us a tam when it's eichel nefesh. You can't say that Taisus holds that. Because then it wouldn't help that there's a necessity for the day if it's not directly food related. Because according to the opinion of Tam, the whole reason that it's mutter is only if it's directly food related. Since Taisus does agree that Beis Hillel, because Beis Hillel says it, that even if it's not letzerich eichel nefesh, it's still mutter. The fact that Beis Hillel is allowing you to do non-food related work on Yomtov implies that Beis Hillel holds that these malachas are mutter. But based on this, we don't understand according to Taisus. Since these malachas were not considered as part of the Isser, so they should be mutter even if you don't need them to be done today. In other words, based on what is Taisus creating this caveat that there has to be a tzerich hayom? Either you tell me, like Rashi says, that these malachas were never asr, and therefore it doesn't matter if it's tzerich eichel nefesh directly or it's shalei tzerich eichel nefesh, it's mutter because it's not malachas avodah. Or you tell me that malachas that are not eichel nefesh are not mutter, like Beis Shammai says, and then if you're carrying a kit to shul, you're not allowed to do it. But Taisus is following the shita of Beis Hillel that you are, but yet, where does this come from? So now we're going to try to explain the shita of Taisus, and what we're going to say is we're going to differentiate between the action itself, the definition of the malacha, and the purpose of the malacha. What am I doing, or why am I doing it? And we're going to say that Rashi is focusing on the actual malacha. What is the malacha? Malacha is carrying. Okay, carrying is mutter because it's needed for food. So Taisus is going to say that it's only mutter if I'm intending to do it for food. In other words, even if we're going to say that these malachas never became asur in the first place, the approach of simin, like the shita of the Ramban, Tosfos is going to say that this heter, this non-iser, only applies with intent for echel nefesh, or with the purpose of echel nefesh. And therefore, if there is no intent, if there's no kavanah for hana, then, according to Tosfos, the iser does apply. Let's see it inside. The Hezron Machlokes zu the Rashi v'Tosfos yesh leimar. To explain this Machlokes of Rashi and Tosfos, we could say as follows: Yisbar leil b'shem Ramban, shemalachas eichel nefesh einan malachas aveda el malachas hana. Explain in the name of the Ramban that food-related work is not considered strenuous work, aveda. It's considered work of enjoyment. And therefore are not included in the Isser of Kol Melechas Aveda Leisasu. Ula Rashi, Hapirish Tisvarazu. According to Rashi, what does this mean? The Melachas Letzedech Eichel Nefesh Ein Be'etzem Sug Miyuchad. The Melachas of food are in their own category, Shemehusan Melechas Hana, which are defined as enjoyable work. Hainu she'einun skukis lekavanas ha'adam ba'asiyas ha'malachas b'chtei lahavchan ha'malachas hana. It doesn't require the person's intent for his own enjoyment to classify it as enjoyable work. By definition, that's what it is. V'lochein ein hefresh ben asiyas malachas elu litachlis v'tzerich shel hana v'tainug. There's no difference whether you're doing this melacha for the purpose of enjoyment or you're doing it not for the purpose of enjoyment. It doesn't matter. The kivan shamalacha mehusa malachas hana, since by definition this is a melacha of enjoyment, it never enters into the prohibition of melechas aveda because it's by definition melechas hana, enjoyable work. You're allowed to do it in all ways, in any case, in any scenario, even if there's no need for it to be done today. According to Rashi, the melacha, these melachas that are food-related melachas, are called melechas hana. By definition, they are melechas hana regardless of why the person is doing it, and therefore, even if there's no benefit to the person or need for today, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the fact that it's a melechas hana, not a melechas aved, and therefore it's mutter. V'das ha-Tosfos. On the other hand, the opinion of Tosfos, gam melachas eichel nefesh einon shoynos b'mehusan mishar melachas. Even though Tosfos agrees that melachas aveda is asur and melachas hana is not asur, nevertheless, Tosfos holds that melachas eichel nefesh is, in its definition, not different than other melachas. Ella, if it's being done for the purpose, for the person's benefit, enjoyment, either tzedech eichel nefesh, either directly for food-related things, or another need that is for the benefit of the day, then they are excluded from the category of melechas aveda and they're not asur. But if it's not needed for today, then they remain in the category of avoida work, strenuous work, which is asur on Yomtov. And therefore Tosfos says you need to have some necessity for the day. Otherwise, what is the trigger to take it out of the category of melechas avoida and into the category of melechas hana? According to Rashi, Rashi says it doesn't matter what my intent is. By definition, food-related melacha is melechas hana. Okay? So therefore, it's mutter. But according to Tosfos, that even food-related melacha starts out in the category, starts out different. Starts out the same as other melachas, which means technically it's melachas aveda. In other words, Eif in the Aleph, which we said before, was that melachas echel nefesh are asuros mitzad atzmam, and the Torah gives you a tam lahatir. Now, that's not the opinion of Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel holds that melachas echel nefesh goes into its own category. But the question now is, according to Rashi and Tosfos, how does it end up in its own category? Does it end up in its own category automatically, or does it end up in its own category based on the person's intent? In other words, according to Tosfos, I need something to trigger this melacha to be considered melachas hana and not melachas aveda. And therefore, either it has to be tzedek echel nefesh, or there has to be a tzedek hayoim. There has to be some need for it. That need triggers it into the category of melachas hana and makes it mutter mitzad atzmai. To say the same thing but in other words, Rashi Soiver, the food that is the work that is being done for food may be done. That by this pasuk, the Torah redefined these melachas to be in their own category based on the very action that's being taken. V'teisa savri the be'acha sheyachal yeyasol lachem egdira atayda malachas elu lefi mataras v'kavanas asiyasam. Torah redefines these malachas based on their purpose and the intent of what they're being used for. Shekish and naas the tzedek hanas adam harei malachas adam, that if they're being used for the person's needs, malachas hanoah, then they are called malachas hanoah. Mulachatchila niklu v'cham malachas aveda, and only then were they not considered part of malachas aveda. Now, pizza yesh leimar. The gamma taste v'sfira le bedas Beis Hillel deichel nefesh usimin v'geder shel sug hamalachas she'einu necholas b'isur malachas aveda. According to this, Tosfos will agree that according to Beis Hillel, deichel nefesh is a simin and not a tam. That that food-related work is not part of malachas aveda and is part of malachas hana. However, according to Tosfos, there has to be mataras v'kavanas asiyas, and there has to be an intent in the person's asiyah in order to activate this category of malachas hana. Good. So this is the hezber, two different signonis. Either you use the words mohus and pe'ula, or you use the word guf ha'pe'ula and kavanas ha'asiyah. Either in the first eif he uses the words, the definition of the work and the action of the work. In the second signon he uses the actual action and the intent of the action. But either way, there's machlekes Rashi and Tosfos within simin gufa, within the approach that that food-related work is a simin of which things never became usher in the first place. However, there's machlekes Rashi and Tosfos what puts it into that category. Is it the very definition of the melacha, what it is, or why it's being done? And therefore, according to Tosfos, there has to be a why, there has to be an intent in order to activate the fact that it's malachas hana. However, now look there's a one-line brackets over here. This just intensifies our question on the Alter Rebbe. Mele, if you were to say for some reason somehow that the Tosfos holds that Eichel Nefesh is Ta'am, you could say that the Alter Rebbe is following Shitas HaTosfos, and therefore he says Hutra. But according to our explanation, that both Rashi and Tosfos hold B'Shitas Beis Hillel, that it's a simin, not a tam, and the machlekes is only what activates the simin. So now the Alter Rebbe comes out to be contradicting Beis Hillel and contradicting himself, and we are stuck with understanding the Alter Rebbe. And therefore, in Ois Hey, we're going to introduce a new explanation in the Machlekes of Rashi and Tosfos. Not the way we said it in the first place, that both Rashi and Tosfos agree that Melacha Seichel Nefesh is a siman for which Melachas were not Asur in the first place. And the Machlekes is the siman based on Gufa Asiya or Kavanas Asiya. The definition of the action or the intent of the action. In Oisei is going to introduce another understanding of the Machlekes Rashi and Tosfos. And here he's going to say that although Rashi follows Shitas HaRamban, that Meleches Eichel Nefesh were never Asur Mitzad Atzmon, and Eichel Nefesh is a simin, not just a tam. We're going to now suggest that Tosfos argues with Rashi, and Tosfos says that Meleches Eichel Nefesh is a tam lahatir, which means to say that the etzem, they are Asur. Inherently, they are forbidden melachos, and it's just that if there's Eichel Nefesh, that if it's Eichel Nefesh, it's a special tam lahatir. Elo shebeoifen haheter svira leile Beis Hillel she'ein hakavona sheletzerich Eichel Nefesh nidcha oiser b'melachos elu hainu שהחשיבות של צדק זה דוחה איסור עשיית מלאכה ביומטוב ולכן אין מותר אלא אם כן צרכן הוא רק לאכול נפש אלא שמצד הצדק הותרו המלאכות לגמרי. I just read a lot because I wanted to say the whole sentence. Now I'm going to explain. First of all, if Tosfos holds that it's a tam, then why are melachos, why according to Beis Hillel could you do something if it's not Tzedek Eichel Nefesh? Why can I carry a baby to shul? If Eichel Nefesh is a tam lahatir, then only if it's actually Eichel Nefesh should it be mutter, which this was our reasoning in the brackets on page 36, when we were explaining why the Chayda Tosfos has to agree with Rashi with regards to tam and siman, because we see that Beis Hillel says that you're allowed to carry a baby. So now he's going to say no. We could still say tam. We could still say that the etzem oichel nefesh is asur on Yomtov. And when the Torah permits it, his Torah is giving you a specific tam lahatir. However, within that permissibility, it could be seen in two ways: dechuya or hutra. Dechuya means it was pushed aside. Hutra means it was made mutter. It was opened up. So if you were to say Dechuya, that Eichel Nefesh, the Torah was Deicha, the Torah pushed away the prohibition of Malacha because the importance of food is so necessary on Yomtov, then, theoretically, then only food-related things would become mutter. Because it was only Dechuya for the specific thing the Torah says. But if you say Hutra, if you say that it was opened up broadly, then the heter that becomes based on the fact of Eichel Nefesh is broader than we would think. Let's say it inside again. That doesn't mean to say that according to Beis Hillel, this Isser was pushed away. That the importance of the need for food pushes aside the prohibition of malacha on Yomtov. But then it would only be mutter only if you need it specifically for food. We're not going to say that according to Beis Hillel, according to Tosfos. We're saying that because you need it for food, the malachas became totally mutter. Therefore, Gam einay tzadich litzamtzim b'malachas eichel nefesh shetei kula k'dei tzedek achilas hayom. And therefore, when we're talking about food, we didn't yet talk about shalei l'tzedek. Still within the category of food, you don't have to minimize the malacha you're doing, so that everything that you're preparing should be for today. And so too, mutter lishchet behema, you're not to shecht an entire behema, gam im einay tzadich ela l'kazayis mipsada, even if you only need a kazayis of the meat. Since this malacha has a need for food, that it becomes totally mutter, even if it's partially or mostly not needed for this cause. So, on the one hand, Tosfos holds tam, not simin, that be'etzem geret these malachas are aser, but on the other holds that one mutter legamri, not just nitcha or dchuya, and therefore the permissibility is much greater. So therefore, I'm allowed to cook a lot more food than I need. I'm allowed to shecht an animal, even if I only need a drop of the meat. Ubazeh. And based on this new concept, that even though it's asher mitzad atzmai, and eichel nefesh is only a tam lahatir, nevertheless, once it was mutter legamri. Based on this, we could explain shitas Beis Hillel, shehitira atera malachas elu, which Torah permits, according to Beis Hillel, Torah permits these malachas gam shalashar tzarchei hana, even for other beneficial purposes, not food related. Ve'habir malachas elu shehutru af im oisin oison l'shar tzarchei hana ha'adam v'lo l'tzedek eichel nefesh. These malachas that became mutter, carrying, boiling, cooking, these malachas that became mutter, even when you're doing them for other needs of the person, yeshba and sada shava l'malachas t'tzedek eichel nefesh. They have a common denominator with malachas that are needed for food, shekulon tzedek ha'adam, that they are for the need of the person. They are for the benefit of the person. V'lochein nechshev tzedek zeh d'shar hanayis ha'adam al kol panim kemiktzis legabe tzedek eichel nefesh. Therefore, these other needs of the person are considered just like the small need that the person has for food that allows him to cook a lot of food. And since we see that food-related work became mutter, even if only a little bit of it is needed for food, it is sufficient to create needs for other things because it is qualitatively a miktzas of the needs of eichel nefesh. In other words, just like I'm allowed to cook 10 gallons, even if I only need a few ounces, so too I'm allowed to do other malachas, do the same malacha for other needs, because once there's a miktzas eichel nefesh here, that miktzas eichel nefesh could be applied to other enjoyments of the person. In other words, just like quantitatively, I could need a little bit, I can cook a lot. So too, qualitatively, once I could do something that's partially, I need a little bit for my needs, I could do other things that are also for my needs, even though it's not eichel nefesh. This is the Tosfos approach, Tosfos' shita in Beis Hillel, that even though it's tam, even though the melacha is asr mitzad atzmai, and the only reason I'm allowed to do it is because I need it for eichel nefesh, but once I'm allowing it for eichel nefesh, I can extrapolate from that any need that I have, since it's connected to a miktzas need of eichel nefesh, therefore I can use it for other needs as well. However, we'll say in the next paragraph, there has to be some need. There has to be some need, otherwise it's not related to Eichel Nefesh. Otherwise, it's not connected. The only way I can connect other needs to the need of food is the fact that they're both needs. But if I don't need it, then it has no connection. And that's why Tosfos says that there has to be a tzedek ktsas. That even with the Iraisa, there needs to be some level of tzedek, because that's the only way it connects to Eichel Nefesh, the fact that they're both tzedek. And this is what Beis Hillel is telling us according to Tosfos. Because it was allowed for the need of food, it was also allowed for other needs as well. Once the melacha became mutter for the need of food, the very melacha became mutter. It became mutter for other non-needs. Meaning to say, for all other non-oichel nefesh needs that are beyond the initial need of oichel nefesh, the small need of oichel nefesh. Whether it is connected to that there's a little bit of oichel nefesh, a small need of Eichel Nefesh that leads me to be able to cook a lot more or prepare a lot more, or whether it is a need that is just commonly related, similar to Eichel Nefesh, somewhat similar to Eichel Nefesh, because they both have a need. In other words, once you use the word miktzas could mean a little bit of food, or miktzas could mean a little bit related. It's somewhat related because they're both needs. So this is how Beis Hillel, this is how Tosfos teaches Beis Hillel. Once it was mutter l'tzedek for the sake of food, huter nami shalei l'tzedek, it also became permissible for anything that's not actually this need, either by quantity that you're cooking a lot more, or by idea that it's something that is related to the need because it's also for the person's benefit, and therefore it becomes mutter. And this is why, like I said before, this is why Tosfos says there has to be a tzedek ktsas, because it has to be connected to the miktzas of Eichel Nefesh. So this is a new hesber in Tosfos, which is very different than the previous one. In the previous one, Rashi and Tosfos were arguing within Siman over Gufa Pa'ula or Kavanas Asiya. Now they're arguing in Siman and Tam. The Rashi, according to Rashi, it's a Siman and was never mutter, never Asr in the first place, and therefore everything is mutter. According to Tosfos, it is inherently Asr. It needs an opening. It needs a tam lahatir. The tam lahatir would be either oichel nefesh or something that's related to oichel nefesh, a miktzas, something that's a little bit related to oichel nefesh because it has a tzad hashava that they both are l'soydech, they both are for the need of the person. Now that we have a new understanding in Tosfos, now we'll be able to apply this understanding in Tosfos to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. And now the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch will be very well understood. This is Ois Vav. According to this above mentioned explanation, and I say, that it's possible to say that even according to Beis Hillel, Beis Hillel holds that Melacha Eichel Nefesh is a tam lahatir and not an open heter. Yesh leimar dad morazak and sfira lekeim. You could say that the Alter Rebbe also follows this shita, that he's following Taka Beis Hillel because the halacha is like Beis Hillel, but not that Beis Hillel holds that it's a siman like we thought originally, or like Rashi shita. But Beis Hillel holds as a tam lahatir. We could say that the Alter Rebbe holds this approach. We use baru heitiv dvarav b'shulchanei, and based on that, the Alter Rebbe's words will be very well explained in Shulchan Aruch u'ba'aktim. But let us first preface one last question. Excuse me. Move on. Madua shina hakasu v'parashaseinu lichtev kol malacha le'yaseh b'hem u'b'meila tzarech lefarish et rasiyas malachas eichel nefesh Harei aval lichtiv ki b'shar hachagim kol melachas aveda v'geimar. ובמילא מובן שמלאכת אוכל נפש אין מלאכת הנאה מלכתחילה לנכללו באיסר. Why does the pasuk in Parshas Boy have to say kol malacha and then have to explain that melakas ochel nefesh are not included? Why couldn't the pasuk in our parsha just do like it does in all the other places? To say melakas aveda, and we would understand that melakas aveda is aser, and melakas hana is not aser, and we would know that you could use food, you could do food-related melachas an Yomtov ve'habir. But the explanation is very simple. The very first time that the prohibition of Malacha and Yomtov is mentioned is in this week's Parsha. In other words, this is the intro. Parsha's Boy is the intro to the whole concept of the Yisra of Malacha and Yomtov. The pasuk is specific and does not write Moshe which that would imply that Melakas Aveda was Melakas Hana, food related work, is never also in the first place. He writes specifically that no malacha should be done without explaining what it is. And it's teaching us that all malachas are asur on Yomtov. And then he adds that which is for food related can be done. From this we understand that these malachas became mutter, that were inherently asur. Teira is matter them mitam because they are needed for the person's food. With Parshas Emer v'chulu mekatzer v'ne'emar b'kol melechas aveda le'yaseh b'hem. In Emer and the other places, he writes more concisely kol melechas aveda. Mikiven shein mokim lites alidezes melechas eichel nefesh le'nesru me'ikar kapirush Ramban, because you won't make the mistake and say the Moshe Eichel Nefesh is not Asur Me'ikar like the Ramban says, which the Alter Rebbe is arguing with. Because already the first time in Torah, when Parshas Bo, he already clarified that all Malachas are Asur Mitzad Atzmam, and Eichel Nefesh is Mutter L'Tzedech Adam. V'hutru mitam shein L'Tzedech Eichel Nefesh, and they were Mutter mitam. So the first time he has to say very clearly, if he did the first time he would say, we would think that Eichel Nefesh never became Asa, like the Shita of the Ramban, like the Shita of Rashi. But the fact that the Pasuk says, saying all Malachas, including Eichel Nefesh, and then excluding Eichel Nefesh specifically, this is to tell me that the Alter Rebbe does not follow the Shita of the Ramban. I mean, this is the Alter Rebbe's proof in the Pasuk that we don't follow the Shita Ramban, that all Malacha is Asur, and Melechas Eichel Nefesh has a Tam La'atir. Now, V'hinei, B'shulchan Aruch, Mevi Yisra Asiyas Malacha B'chol HaChagim. Shulchan Aruch, he brings now, what we don't understand yet is why the Alter Rebbe seems to, in the beginning of his words, seems to imply that all malacha, that Melechas Eichel Nefesh is never asur in the first place, that malacha only includes other malachas. That's what it seemed like from the way we learned it the first time. But now that we have a whole new understanding in this whole idea, we'll now go through the Shulchan Aruch and we'll see it means very differently. Number one, we just established that from the very pasuk itself, there's the first time it mentions it, and then every time after that, the first time it mentions it, it has to speak about all malachas, and then exclude Eichel Nefesh specifically. We now understand that according to the Alter Rebbe, he follows Shittas HaTosfos in the understanding of Beis Hillel, that the malacha is Asur mitzad atzmai, but only mutter mitam Eichel Nefesh or mitam tzorech. So now let's understand the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Maybe Yisrael malacha b'chol hachagim. Shulchan Aruch is talking about Melacha and all Yom Tov. Melacha maybe a kasha sebachal hachagim v'chol melacha saved that is a leike, and therefore he brings the pasuk, which is referring to all the Yom Tovim of melacha saved. Shenemar kol melacha leisasu umeisif levayir umau melacha saved kol melacha shenasis beichol mashke. And he explains when in other words, he uses the pasuk, not the one that's spoken of by Pesach. He uses the pasuk that's by all the Yom Tovim because he's talking about all Yom Tovim. He's not talking just about Pesach. So he uses the pasuk that's by all Yom Tov, which is Melechas Aveda. Then he explains, what is Meleches Aveda? Melacha that is not food related. Hainu b'pasuk zeh eina meduber ela b'negei Meleches Aveda v'loi nisparesh din Meleches Eichel Nefesh. The Alter Rebbe is not saying that Meleches Eichel Nefesh is not included in Kol Melacha. The Alter Rebbe is telling us that this pasuk of Meleches Aveda does not discuss Eichel Nefesh. Because Meleches Aveda, because Meleches Eichel Nefesh is not Meleches Aveda. So he starts out when he says, Kol Melacha she'ein nasa b'Eichel Mashke, is not to say that the Eichel Mashke is mutter. He's saying that with the pasuk Meleches Aveda does not address Eichel Nefesh yet. Now we're talking about all other melachas. And what are they? Osir and Yomtov. And therefore, now we have to know what about Eichel Nefesh. We don't know anything about Eichel Nefesh. Not like in the beginning we thought that at this point it seems that Eichel Nefesh is mutter. No. The Rebbe explains, the Alter Rebbe here, is based on the fact that in Chumash, when it says Meleches Aveda, it's not talking about Eichel Nefesh. Because we already understand from Parshas Bo that Eichel Nefesh is a separate category. When the Alter Rebbe says Eichel Nefesh, it says Meleches Aveda, he has to explain. I'm not talking about Eichel Nefesh. Not that Eichel Nefesh is mutter. I just don't know yet what Eichel Nefesh is. And then he continues to explain Din Meleches Eichel Nefesh. To explain what is the Din Eichel Nefesh and its Mokir. When it comes to other melachos, these are called Melachas Eichel Nefesh, and the Torah permits you to do it. And again, the word hitira implies that it's asher mitzad atzmai, and it's just to have a special, unique heter. Shenemar ach asher yochel lechol nefesh ulvada yosel lachem. The omrei ach mashma dimimata umitzia miklal isur. And from the word ach is a lashon of ach is a lashon of a miyut. That ach is saying, but there is one exclusion, and that is eichel nefesh. Hitira, the Torah was matir it. So then the Alter Rebbe says, after telling me that other melachos are aser, then he says, however, eichel nefesh has a special heter. Like Tosfos says. Not like Rashi that it's a siman and there was never aser mitzad atzmai. And therefore, there's no real steer in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Because the first step when he's talking about Meleches Aveda, he's not addressing Meleches Eichel Nefesh. He's just talking about Meleches Aveda, and he says that clearly. What's Meleches Aveda? Anything that's not Eichel Nefesh. Then he has to tell you, and what about Eichel Nefesh? Eichel Nefesh is Hitira, it's Hutra. It's permissible. Because even though inherently it's Aser, it's a Malacha, but nevertheless, the Torah was matir it meat because it's for the tzedek of the person. Simchas Yomtov. Yizayin va'irov avedis Hashem. The irov avedis Hashem is as follows: Mizeh she'atera hitira malachis ha'utzuris b'yomtiv l'tzedek achilas yomtiv. From the fact that the Torah was matir malachis that are inherently aser on yomtiv, but for the sake of eating on yomtiv, the Torah permits it. Nira ad kama simchas yomtiv hu inyan ikri b'me'adim. This teaches us how much of a primary concept of an important idea simcha is on Yom Tov. Like the pasuk says, me'adim l'simcha. That the light of the Yom Tovim shines every day, not just on Yom Tov. And according to this lesson that we just learned, that simcha is so important on Yom Tov, that a person has to carry and feel and experience this simchas Yom Tov for the whole year. Zeisei meres. The neisef al simchas adam be'eski ma mitzvah simchas shal mitzvah. Besides the fact that a person has to be joyful during the fulfillment of a mitzvah, which is the union of simchas shal mitzvah. The light of the Yontif impacts the person that he should feel simcha the entire day. That even when he's not engaged specifically in a mitzvah, he should still feel the simcha. So not only do we have to have simcha and Yomtiv, and simcha and Yomtiv is so important that we're even allowed to do melachas eichel nefesh or melachas of tzedek and Yomtiv, but then that simcha has to carry through into the rest of the year. And even during our regular mundane work that we're doing, we should still feel a simcha from Yom Tov, that it should permeate and uplift us with a simcha for the entire day.